This is the solution for exercise 5C. In this part of the exercise, we're actually going to start writing some code. So the first thing we need to do is be able to write our tests. We're going to use the Mocha framework for our tests, but we also need another library to allow us to actually create all the tests. So the first thing we're going to do, again, in our command line, and remember, you need to be in the directory of the project. So here I'm in the Git and then my project directory. And we're just going to enter npm install chai. And we're going to save this into the package.json file. And again, just make sure we bring that in with an F5 to bring that into the Eclipse view. And now we're going to configure Mocha to use chai. So in the test directory, we're going to create a file called support.js. So new file, support.js. And then the contents of this and then we save that file. And then we want to create another file in the test folder for Mocha options, the Mocha opt file. So file, and this is called Mocha opts. And this just tells Mocha to use that support.js file. And again, don't forget to save the file. So now we've configured Mocha to use the chai library, we can write our first test. So to do that, right click, file, we want a new file, and we're going to call this fizzbuzz.test.js. And the first thing we're going to do with this test is actually load the file where we're going to implement the fizzbuzz functionality. So we say var fizzbuzz equals require, and we're actually going to pull in from our root directory the file where we're going to actually implement the fizzbuzz functionality. And then when we write a test, we use a describe clause. And the first function that we're going to implement is divisible by. So when we think about fizzbuzz, we need to know if a number is divisible by either 3 or 5 to work out what the value should be. So the first part of the algorithm that we'll implement is divisible by. So we're going to write a test for divisible by. So that's our first test all written now. And we're simply going to say when 3 is divisible by 3, we'd expect that to return true. One thing we can do is to get Mocha to run continuously. And we do that by running the Mocha with the option -w. So on Mac and Linux, you have to use /, but here on Windows, we run Mocha by running from the node modules directory in the .bin folder, Mocha, and then it's Mocha -w. And that will continuously run the tests. So obviously, we're going to fail currently because we can't actually find the module because we haven't yet written it. So with test-driven development, you write the code necessary to pass the test. So the first thing we need to do, obviously, is go into our project, new file, and we're going to create the FizzBuzz.js file, because that's the first thing our test is asking for. And then once we're in that file, we need to actually create the FizzBuzz object. So var So now we get an error saying that undefined is not a function. And that's because we haven't defined the divisible by function. So the next thing we can do is go in and create that function. And again, we want to write the minimum code to pass the test. So the test is 3 divided by 3, and we can just return true to pass that test. And there you can see we've now got the test passing. Previously you saw that we had a failure because we'd missed a semicolon, and then we had the lint failing the test because of the missing semicolon. But now we've got our divisible test pass, and all our code passes the static analyzer. So now we want to go in and modify the test and add another test clause. So we now know that 3 divided by 3 is true, but what happens when we have 3 divided by 2? We'd expect that to be false. So I can come back in here and I can just add another test. Save that. And now we get a failure because we're expecting a value of false and we're actually getting true. So we're failing this test. And that's clearly because we haven't implemented the functionality. So what we can do now is we can now go and change this to make sure it passes all the tests. So we're going to use modulo, and we expect that to be equal 0. Now, a typo here, you'll see that we both got the warning in Eclipse and we've also got the warning coming up in our tests. And what it's saying is that I can't assign a 0 to an operation because obviously a single equal sign is an assignment and I want to do a comparison. So let's fix that. And in JavaScript, that's still not correct, because 2 equals allows it to do type coercion. And because we've got a static number, ideally we need to use the 3. So if I put the 3 equals in there, then all my warnings go away, and now I pass my static analyzer test, but also my divisible, when divisible and when not divisible tests. So that just shows you that the static analyzer can be quite useful for very simple typos as you're coding. So that's the first function we've now implemented, the divisible by. And one of the other concepts of doing agile development is to integrate continuously. So now would be a good time to actually check this code into the source repository. And again, I can now just use the Git staging view, select all the files, drag them into the staged, and I can now enter a commit message. And a simple commit and push will send that code to the repository. And we're showing that we're now fully synchronized. So the next thing we want to do, now that we can work out if a number is divisible, is implement the test to say what happens when I want to convert a number. So after this set of tests, I'm going to describe so now we've written a test for another function called convert to fizzbuzz, and when I pass it the number 3, I expect the output to be fizz. So the first thing we need to do after saving this file is go and implement and the test that we have will allow us simply to return the string fizz. Save the file, and we now pass this test. So when convert to fizzbuzz, when divisible by 3 is now passing. So what we're going to do now is we're also going to add another test to fizz, and also a test for buzz. So back in here, I can just add another expect clause. And I'm going to say 6, and I would also expect that to be equal to fizz. And then I'm going to add another test, and then we can also add the test for, there we go. So now when I save this, again, we're returning fizz and we're expecting buzz. And that's quite natural because currently we haven't actually implemented the functionality. So let's put this code correct. So we can say if and then we can see that all the tests are passing. So let's go and finish this off. And I want to say when something is divisible by both 3 and 5, which means it is actually divisible by 15. And then I'm just going to finish off and add the final test. Okay, so again, we are failing some tests. So let's go and finish the implementation of our convert to FizzBuzz function. And there we go. So we do have an error still. And obviously, if you look at the reason, again, a simple coding error. We need this test to be done before 3 and 5. Because we're passing the fizz function. So again, we'll just move that above there. We're now going to check the FizzBuzz. Sorry, wrong file. You need to move this. So if we look at here, we've got to move this file above here. So now we check for the FizzBuzz case before we check for either fizz or buzz. And I can now save that, and there we go. We're now passing all our tests. So again, this would be another good time just to come in here and commit those changes. Left that one behind. The last thing we need to do for this part of the exercise is to work out how to convert a range of numbers into the FizzBuzz value. But when we actually come to write the tests, we don't want to repeat the tests previously done in the convert to FizzBuzz. So what we need to do is we just need to test that we're using the functionality of convert to FizzBuzz correctly. And to do this, we can use another test function. And this allows us to spy on function calls as they happen in the test. So I'm just going to do a Control-C to terminate the mocker, because we need to do an npm install sign on, and again save dev. And then we also need to do a second install to link it into Chai. So we've added those two new requirements, so F5 to ensure that they come into the Eclipse environment. And then what we've got to do is we've got to go back into support.js and bring in the new library and also configure it within the tests. So there we go. That's now completed that. So then in our test suite, we're going to go and add a test for our last function, convert range to FizzBuzz. And the first test we want to do is just to make sure that we get the correct results back in the correct order. So here we'd expect, if we ask for a range 1 to 3, we're going to end up with 1, 2, then fizz. So this test is just to make sure that we're not constructing that range in the wrong order, so we don't get fizz 2, 1 back or anything similar to that. So to implement that test, let's just start the Mocha again. So again, we're going to get an undefined function because we haven't added that function. So let's come into here and create the function. And for this first test, we can simply return the expected values. And there you are, we're passing all the tests again. So the next test, we want to check that for every number in the range, we call convert to FizzBuzz with the correct parameter. So we just want to make sure that when we're actually going to convert a range, we call convert to FizzBuzz once for every number in that range. And for that, we're going to use the new library that we've just added. So at the top of the file, we just make the library available. And then we're just going to check it applies FizzBuzz to every number in the range correctly. And we're going to use a SPI. And a SPI listens to a function. And in our case, that function is convert to FizzBuzz. So we create the SPI, and then we call the function that we're spying on, and then we add the test to say what happened. And we expect the SPI to be called once with every argument, with every value in the range. And what we can do is, if this test fails, we can actually put a better message out here. So we're just saying that we expect this to be called with the function. And then once I've finished with the SPI, I remove it. And you remove it by just using the restore function. So there's the test. We set up the SPI, we then call convert range to FizzBuzz, and then for every element in that range, we expect the spied on function to be called once with every argument in the range. So I save that, and obviously we'd expect it to be called, but until we implement it, it obviously isn't going to be called. So let's go and implement this functionality. And there we are. We're actually passing all the tests. So again, this would be a good time just to go and push all of the code changes. And for those eagle-eyed, there is actually a bug in this code still. We talk about it in the lecture, and we'll find that and fix that in the next section. But this terminates exercise 5C.